My role today is the privilege of introducing our moderator, who is Valerie Reyna. She's a member of our DBAS Board of Advisors and the Lois and Melvin Tuchman Professor of Human Development and Psychology at Cornell, where she directs the Human Neuroscience Institute and co-directs the Center for Behavioral Economics and Decision Research. We're really thrilled that it's Valerie doing this today because she embodies that spirit of multidisciplinary, as you can hear from her various affiliations, the multidisciplinary approach that is going to be exemplified by these presentations today. And Valerie is famous for her contributions to fuzzy trace theory, a model of how images in the brain are connected to decision making. And it's been widely applied in law, medicine, and public health. In academic circles, she's equally famous for her role as a generous collaborator and a genuinely nice person. And so I look forward to her moderation of today's event. And with that, I turn it over to Valerie Reyna. Valerie.
Well, thank you, Mike, for that incredibly kind introduction. I really appreciate it. And I want to welcome everyone to the Symposium on Responding to COVID-19, Emerging Insights from Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences. So the symposium, as Mike said, is organized and sponsored by the Division of Behavioral and Social Sciences and Education Advisory Committee. And as Mike said, I'm a member of that committee. I want to thank the National Academy staff, the speakers, the universities who support the speakers' work, and the sponsors of this event. We really couldn't have done it without you. Tremendously grateful. I was asked to make a few general remarks to frame our discussion about the societal impacts of COVID-19. And Aaron, take it away. There we go. And that's who I am. There we go. So why research? Why is research so important in this era of COVID-19? Well, the societal impact of COVID-19 is enormous. And I know you're going to be able to hear that in detail from the speakers. But I also want you to know that although we're going to describe the impact, we're also going to talk about how to lessen that impact, how to reverse the impact in some cases, and even to thrive in the face of that impact through innovation and the incredible flexibility and adaptability of human beings. We can cope, especially if we apply scientific research. And I found a quote. I was talking with Aaron before this meeting, and we were talking about lighting a candle rather than cursing the darkness. And I found this quote of John F. Kennedy from 1960, and I think it's so appropriate now. We are not here to curse the darkness, but to light the candle that can guide us through that darkness to a safe and sane future. How prescient. Next slide. So the first panel is going to talk to you about social, behavioral, and economic sciences. And the very first talk is going to be talking about preventable deaths. And right now, before we have a vaccine, what is going to happen to us with respect to COVID-19 is a question of human behavior. It's a question of human behavior before we get a vaccine. Do we wash our hands, socially distance, wear masks? This is all human behavior and psychology. After we get a vaccine, it's a question of whether people trust the vaccine, trust that it's safe and effective. So before and after a vaccine, it's a question of human behavior. Only about half the people who should get a flu vaccine get it. And that's not enough. And 30 to 60,000 people die a year from the flu. So that's the prospect that we're looking at, communicating with human beings about the necessity to take their fate in their hands. The next talk is going to talk about intangible trauma. We often think about trauma in terms of physical trauma, but the psychological traumas of COVID-19 are very real, and we're going to tell you about that. The third talk is going to be talking about learning loss. I know we're very concerned about the schools, And learning, too, is a question of psychological science. Learning is a cognitive science, the study of that, and the opportunity to learn has a lot to do with social science, and we're going to hear about that. A theme that runs through all the talks is the question of disparities. And, disparities certainly are a question of values, but they're also a phenomena that can be studied scientifically, and we often don't think about that. Now, there's a distinction between the facts of science and what we do about it. And as I said, what we do about it is a matter of values. Next slide. The second set of speakers are going to be talking about incredibly important topics also, and what could be more important than the food supply chain. And this is a question of decision sciences and operations research. And I should add, as just a personal editorial note, I think it's very important for us to think about which key sectors we really have to have represented domestically. Medicines and medical supplies are an obvious example in addition to food supply. In fact, I have thought a lot about decision-making in these contexts, and there's some predictable psychological pitfalls of optimization. And those pitfalls have sort of made us so efficient that we don't have redundancy, and the redundancy is extremely important. So the next talk in the second session, we'll talk about the differential impact of work changes. And I think it's important now to think about the essential workers. And I just want to thank them, all the essential workers who we're going to talk about in part, but who've made such a difference. Then the last talk in that session will be transmission in nursing homes. And nursing homes, really, that whole issue of the transmissibility of COVID-19, how incredibly transmissible it has been, is important to remember in terms of the valuing of all human lives. But it also really illustrates how we're all connected to one another. It's in the nursing homes, but it becomes in the society at large very easily, and vice versa. Next slide. So I think our message is that we are on the brink of really very important and perhaps dire health, economic, and social outcomes. We've already experienced dire health outcomes. But I think we can overcome. We can overcome if we take advantage of human knowledge, of rigorous science. We can even use this as an opportunity to make long-lasting changes. And there's certainly historical precedence for that. I think, and this is again an editorial note of my own, we've been very focused as social scientists among ourselves on each other, on replication, generality, and those are all great goals. But I think we've gone a little overboard, and I think in this time of emergency, we have to renew our focus on quality science, peer review, so that we can address these major concerns, these emergencies really, far better. And in particular, the key to this is going to be understanding causal mechanisms, why people behave the way they do. Next slide. So scientists advise, but the people decide. And the people decide through their policymakers. And this is important to remember what our role is. Science can provide facts, and these are necessary, but they're not sufficient for public policy. But it's very important for the black box of human behavior to be demystified. Our lives depend on it. Scientists can serve an important role as honest brokers. We all might have our personal opinions, but we actively seek to prove ourselves wrong. That's one of the most important hallmarks of science. It's not perfect, but it does self-correct, at least maybe not linearly, but it's a process, and it can provide really essential information to policymakers. Now, the line between facts and inference, of course, is fuzzy, but we do have a process for self-correction. Next slide. Fuzzy. Speaking of fuzzy, I was asked to provide a brief word about some of the work that I've done. And the theory that, as Mike mentioned, that I and my colleagues have developed is called fuzzy trace theory. And it's an evidence-based theory of how people, including lay people and experts, make decisions about risk. I direct you to some references because I don't have time to go into the detail. A recent paper in PNAS, if you just put Reyna PNASEM. It'll probably come up. These are all open access at the moment, and your favorite search engine will probably find them. I talk about misinformation and how there are alternatives to approaches we have today for changing people's views about misinformation, for dealing with disinformation, things about like vaccination that are so critical. And I want to recognize the contributions of Paul Slovic in influencing the work that I talk about in that PNAS article. In the Trends in Cognitive Sciences article, I talk about why the public and experts are unlikely to perceive the same risk from COVID-19, but the psychology of that is and what to do about it, and how to make decisions about COVID-19 based on testing and using Bayesian theory. And finally, in this article in the journal Chest, I talk about social and psychological contributions to health and how all these come together. And the bottom line implication of the theoretical work and empirical work that I've done is that there's a third way to influence people. There is knowledge on the one hand and providing facts, and there's obviously the role of bias too. But in addition to these two mechanisms, there's giving and getting the gist of the information, and that accounts for unique variance.